Well, welcome everyone to day 2 of training. Thanks for joining if you joined us the first time. So in the first session, we sent around the training recording, and there's these session recordings all going onto a YouTube channel for future reference, as well as this documentation site that I just mentioned. We'll be continuing to add documentation and links to some of the training decks as we move through these few sessions. So we're in day 2 of this more higher level introduction to what these solutions are, how they might be leveraged. And today we're going to be talking about this rapid deployment solution where you can take a Kobo form and very quickly spin up a destination database as well as an integration to actually take your data collection tool and turn it into a data management system with a live sync to funnel data back and forth. So as we're introducing that, we're going to talk a little bit more generally about Kobo Toolbox as an application, specifically how Kobo Toolbox works in a very high level, how you might extract data from a tool like Kobo Toolbox. But a lot of these concepts that we're speaking about that are specific to Kobo also apply to other mobile data collection tools your organization might be using. So if you're using OpenDataKit or ONA or some of these other mobile data collection tools, the concepts are very similar, just the exact steps might be slightly different. And that's where we can certainly point you in the right direction. So I know James kind of brought up OMA in the last session, so we can speak a little bit to that specifically. But the second half of today, we will be getting a little bit more hands-on with this automation solution. So heads up, it is a bit more, we're getting into the weeds of the thing. We're going to actually be clicking around. We're going to have to make sure some of this terminology sticks. But this is very much for actually using the solution. So if you're someone at your organization who's probably not going to be setting up the solution, great to follow along and just like see how it works end to end. But I think the second half of the session is, we'll try to keep things high level, but we'll continue to build on that over the next couple of days. So for those that are wanting to get a bit more hands-on, configure the session maybe, or the solution a little bit more for their use case, things like that, they'll have those options and learn a lot more about how OpenFN works as these building blocks from the ground up. But to start, we just want to recap day 1, make sure we're all on the same page, and then talk about Kobo. So quick day recap. What are some things that we learned in day 1? Anyone want to pipe up or drop a quick chat?
We learned where OpenFN intervenes in the data integration flow.
Yes, that's right. So understanding, how OpenFN might be this middle integration layer for connecting your whole technology stack. What about Kobo Toolbox? Who learned about Kobo Toolbox for the first time? Any hands up? Okay, fantastic. I see a hand up. Anyone who wants to share what that is? Matthias, is that you? First time learning about Kobo?
No, that wasn't me. If I raised my hand, sorry about that.
No worries. Remy, Caroline, anyone? What they learned Kobo Toolbox is?
Well, we learned. To me, it sounded like Kobo Toolbox was very similar to the ODK system that we're using at the moment, a sort of an automated online form way of producing these survey forms that you can then link to databases or to other kind of data management systems through OpenFN.
Exactly. So just another mobile data collection tool. OpenDataKit, ODK, Survey CTO, ONA, all of these being very similar, but same concept in that a user can download a form and in an offline setting, collect information on mobile and sync that back. Mm-hmm. Awesome. And then we also talked a little bit about, great, we have Kobo for data collection, we have OpenFN as this middle layer, and then as an output, we have a couple different options. We have database systems that you might set up yourself or that your organization might already have, or you might leverage ConSoSci Connect. which is that solution in development that also offers some out-of-box visualizations for standard indicators and things like that. So maybe some quick hands. Is anyone working with their own database at their organization currently, or have some sort of destination database that they're mapping to? Okay, cool. And for those of you who are not, do you maybe have someone on your team who is familiar with database systems? Or I don't know, if anyone doesn't have someone on their team or not familiar with that, do you mind just dropping a kind of a quick chat or a hands up if you haven't worked with a database system or don't have that one, some person on your staff? Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit high level about that. But if you don't have that person on your team or yourself that are familiar with that database setup and stuff like that, we'll start to point you in the right direction. But that's something that we're not going to totally get into today. But what we will talk about is a little bit of like, assuming you're using Kobo Toolbox, assuming you have some sort of database system to map to, how can you then leverage OpenFN to connect the two? But again, the concepts are usually transferable to other data collection tools or data systems that you're using. We also learned about jobs. And jobs are kind of the core engine of OpenFN. They're these scripts of mapping information from one system to another. So we might use jobs to get or extract data. But we also might use jobs to load data, to clean data, to perform all sorts of tasks and operations. So we're going to talk a lot more about jobs today. But remember, jobs are like those integration scripts, those tasks that you want to perform when connecting with different applications. And again, a nice automated way to replace maybe a manual task that someone in your organization is responsible. If that looks like exporting data to Excel, and then importing it to another system rather than doing that manually, you can automate that through a job. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about jobs today, and specifically how jobs interact with different applications, APIs. And for those of you that might be hearing API for the first time, it stands for Application Programming Interface. And it's essentially a portal for accessing an application. And an API is almost like a portal with rules. Some people describe it as like a contract. And they say that if you want to interact with my application in a certain way, you must follow these very specific sets of steps. So if you want to get information, you must ask for information in a certain way. If you want to update information, you must update it in a certain way. I sometimes like to think of APIs as like a drive-through restaurant. So when I'm driving up and I want to maybe order some food for takeaway, I can't just go up and ask for anything on my mind. I need to read the menu and then decide what will I request from the restaurant, and then I'll get some sort of response. And if I'm going off the menu, if I'm going off, what they say they're going to deliver, and if I ask in the right way, then I'm going to get a response that I might expect. So similarly, all web applications, modern web applications these days, have configured this API, and it's a way to open up their application to other systems securely. But because every application is different, every API has its own ways that you can work with it. Some APIs will give you all sorts of access. You can get data, you can transform data, you can rework the application. Some APIs are a lot more restrictive and only let you do a couple set of tasks. But if you're able to go and you're able to search and see, hey, I want to connect to this application. I want to connect to, for example, Kobo Toolbox. And you Google Kobo Toolbox API. Usually a lot of these applications have really robust documentation around what information you can pull, what type of actions you can do. And so generally, if you're ever thinking about, hey, can OpenFN integrate with this application I'm using? What you can do is you can go ahead and you can Google that application's name and API. So for example, if I wanted to integrate with ONA, I might just search for ONA, which is another mobile data collection tool, and it's API documentation. And here it tells me what type of data is accessible. So like here I can see there's charts, there's different types of data endpoints, things like that. Similarly with Kobo Toolbox. And so when you have a tool like OpenFN that's online on the cloud, we also are constantly communicating with other applications APIs to get data and to load data. So does anyone have any quick questions here on APIs? Cool. Well, the key concepts doc that I linked to that has a little bit more about it. But usually when we want to get information from an API or load information from an API, there's a certain rules around how we send those requests. And when we're doing these requests over the web, we use standard with HTTP. And believe it or not, you all are every day making HTTP requests from your computer. If you go to a website, so if, for example, if I go to openfn.org, for example, you'll see in the web browser that usually what it's adding is that HTTP at the beginning of it. So I'm making a web request to this website, and I'm getting some sort of response. So as a web user, this is I see a nice web page. I get this response and data. Similarly, when we're integrating with applications, what OpenFN might do, it might send some sort of HTTP request. But rather than getting this nice visual website response, we get data in different formats. So usually we're working with data in what we call a JSON format, which if you can see on my screen there, that's kind of that characteristic key value pairs. You have different keys or field names, and then you have values, actual data that's being responded to. So with OpenFN, if you're working with an application and it has some sort of web API, then you can set up OpenFN to make these HTTP requests automatically to get data as well as to load data into these applications.
Alexa, your screen share stopped at some point. Can you reshare?
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Yep, it's back.
Awesome, thanks. But that's one way we can communicate. Also with databases, we can write to databases in a language called SQL or SQL. So who here has worked with SQL before? Hands up, anyone? Jonathan? Okay, Mateus, okay. Diane, awesome. So for those of you who haven't worked with SQL, this is a very database thing. But it's a language for manipulating both database metadata as well as data itself. So you can write these little scripts like insert data into a table or alter a table to add a column. So anything that you might be doing in SQL, or if you have someone on your team who's already familiar with database configuration and writing SQL and feels really comfortable with that, they can also use OpenFN to automate some of those SQL executions and actions. And the output of that is not only can you use OpenFN to get data to and from applications via APIs, but if you also have a database that might be its own custom database, it might not belong to some fancy web app, it might be something that someone on your team stood up or something that you yourself deploy over the next week. You can still use OpenFN to access that database as well and to manipulate that database. So we're going to be talking a little bit about this today and how OpenFN can help you get from having a Kobo data collection tool to having an integration to also having somewhere a database to put that integration. And so what we'll show kind of at a high level is that OpenFN can be set up to get data and then to load it into the proper destination in the database. But anyone have any quick questions here on just SQL or HTTP or APIs? Cool. Well, to be continued and check out those key concepts if these are new terms to you. So the other thing that, jobs are these main scripts, right? These open function engines for doing all these tasks, like getting data, writing SQL scripts. But when the data comes back in from Kobo, so if we go get data from Kobo, Kobo responds to us with JSON. And in open function, what happens is you'll see a message appear in your open function inbox or your open function project. So if you all have your open function project open and you click over to inbox and you start clicking around, you'll see a number of different messages. And if you click into a message, this is what a message looks like. And in that message body is the actual JSON. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this today. But Open Functions Inbox shows you all your data that you might have received from other applications. So you might have 5 jobs running, pulling from all different Kobo forms, from Open Data Kit, from some other application. But then all those jobs will take that data and it'll load it into your inbox, where then it can be processed onwards to another system. And by having this data here just temporarily, you can start to see what the shape of that data looks like, and therefore decide how it should be integrated with other systems. So we'll talk a little bit more about messages today, but the other key word to remember is runs. So if you have a job, so a set of instructions for what Open Function should do. If you have messages, your data, and what you can do is you can set up those jobs to run automatically and process those messages or that data. And then that is recorded as a run. So run is like your log or your activity history. It tells you what happened when that job ran. And that way you can see the history and the audit trail of how messages or data are processed and sent onwards to different systems. Because you might configure jobs to pull from one source or multiple sources. And similarly, you can also map data from one or multiple sources to one or multiple destinations. So you can have data going to your own organization's database, as well as to another database, maybe shared by some partner organizations. Or you might set up ConSoSci Connect and have data collection forms that you're collecting for key indicators mapped there, but then some other kind of one-off data collection forms mapping to your own structured database. And that way, but this activity history provides you the central view of all the runs. So you can see that full audit trail of exactly where data goes and when. So we're going to be interacting a little bit with that today, but jobs, messages, and runs being the key open function terms that we'll want to make sure that we remember. So any quick questions?
One just very quick question. So is it, when you were saying that it's like a lot of the stuff around databases and SQL and stuff and APIs is very new to me. I kind of like know the terms, but not the detail. But when you say that you use then SQL to write to the database, but you use jobs within Open Function, is it that your job is automating that process of writing to the database with SQL? Or am I mixing up my...
That's exactly right. So
Okay.
you can configure your jobs to do all sorts of automation tasks. The main 2 tasks that your jobs will probably do are sending HTTP requests. So that's to get data, for example, or to load data to a web app. The second main thing your job might do is write SQL, which is database specific. SQL is database specific. And so that allows us to both change the configuration or the metadata of the database, as well as to actually load data. So even if you're not too familiar with SQL and going about this for the first time, you'll see on my screen on the right, that's an example job in Open Function that's writing SQL. And it's very straightforward statements. So you're inserting, you're updating, you're deleting. It's like those types of database operations. And then you specify within that what you're doing. So when I insert, what am I inserting? And so that's kind of like, we'll get into this a little bit more with some examples, but it's just, are you working with a web app or are you working with a database? And you'll either have a job that's sending HTTP requests or you'll have a job that's writing SQL.
Cool. Okay, great. Thank you.
Cool. And maybe it's just worth reiterating, you know, the way we've set this up is that there's kind of 3 levels that people will be working. There's a level we all covered in our first session, where basically we're going to have everything set up in the background and people won't need to know anything about databases, APIs, anything. There's what we're going to cover today, which it's useful to know about APIs and databases and be able to read this code, but you still actually won't need to do anything because it's all going to be automated. And then there's the advanced level where you kind of have to know more than kind of what they are. You actually have to know how to manipulate them. But again, great to see people embracing these idea of new concepts. Just to reiterate, you won't have to use these tool sets. You won't have to become experts in SQL or in APIs or anything like that. It's just good that you're aware of them.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Any other quick questions?
Yeah, just to check, Alexa, if I understand correctly. So in my OpenFN account, I can see all the jobs in the job section on the left, and I can see all the runs in the activity history and the messages in the inbox.
That's correct. So if you all see my screen, jobs, what are we doing? What are the tasks we want to perform? Inbox is what data has come in for us to process or to perform these tasks on. And each of these rows is an individual message, which corresponds to an individual Kobo form submission. So if you collected 5 survey responses, you might see 5 messages pop up here in your inbox. And then you have activity history, which is the history of OpenFN jobs working with those messages. So if OpenFN is syncing data, you can see, hey, was there a failure or did it successfully make it to the database? Cool. So we'll come back to this again and again. Any other quick questions? Awesome. Well, if you take nothing away, just jobs, runs, and messages, and we'll come back to this one again. So when we talk about syncing information with different applications, we can use these HTTP requests or to send requests to different APIs. Common requests might be GET or POST to create data or update data. And so with syncing with Kobo specifically, we're typically interacting with the Kobo API to get information out of that Kobo API. But Kobo also provides us with a second option for syncing data. And this applies to most mobile data collection applications that are out there. But usually these mobile data collection tools will either give you an option to forward the data to your application. So if OpenFN is our middle layer and we want to get data out of Kobo, we can either schedule an OpenFN job that will run nightly, let's say, and every night it will pool and get data from Kobo Toolbox. Or we can set up something what we call a webhook in Kobo that will actually forward the data to OpenFN. And that's nice because OpenFN doesn't need to go and ask for that data. But the interesting thing we've learned about with Kobo is that option doesn't always forward clean data. So what we're focusing on today is how do you use OpenFN to pool data on a scheduled basis. So every day, every hour, every week. But there is an option for as soon as a submission is submitted to Kobo, so as soon as survey data is collected, it can be forwarded to OpenFN. But if you're an organization that's using Kobo quite heavily, if you're interacting with the Kobo data quite a lot in the Kobo application itself, we recommend using this OpenFN extract option rather than this forwarding option. And for those of you that are totally new to Kobo, I'm going to flip over to my screen here. Can you all see the Kobo toolbox here?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. So Kobo has these once you first sign in, there are all these different forms or data collection tools that you might set up. So here we have a sharks and rays form. We have the swim marché form where we're collecting different data. And in these forms, we're asking all sorts of questions. And if you can configure these forms on XLS, but Kobo also provides this form editor for actually building the questions and organizing how the questions are asked, how many times certain questions might be re-asked, things like that. So it looks like it's taking a moment to load. I think it's a little slow with the screen share.
Maybe we have a screen share on that.
There we go. So here you can say, here's my form in Kobo where I'm collecting data on sharks and rays. When I'm collecting that information, I might be asking some basic questions, just, what day was the survey taken, GPS, country, landing site, so on. But then I also might be recording, how many boats, what was the catch, things like that. So this is the Kobo's point and click interface for configuring forms. But if you've used another tool like ODK, there's also the XLS option where you can build out these data collection forms in Excel and then upload them to Kobo Toolbox here. But once you have these forms uploaded, they appear in your library here. And so Kobo sometimes calls these individual forms projects. So you might have this one form that's collecting data just for one site. You might have one form that's collecting data for multiple sites, or depending on how you're administering the forms, maybe you have some in English, some in French. You might have many different forms that are all capturing the same type of data. So you might have one form or multiple forms, just however you're deciding to roll out your data collection. But once you start collecting this data and users are collecting it on their mobile phones, it will sync to Kobo. And so if I go to data and if I go to table, I can actually start to see submissions as they come in. So here it looks like I have one submission that came in today, capturing information in Tanzania, and I can actually see the responses here. And so if your organization is wondering, like thinking about streamlining your data collection tools or wants to take advantage of Kobo Toolbox, if you have a form, you can also pull from the collection that ConSoSci has a collection of public forms. You can take those forms, you can upload it to your own Kobo project, and then users can download the Kobo app and they can just start collecting data. And as soon as they start syncing it, you'll see it here in this web app. And this is just Kobo alone, what Kobo offers. And what we see a lot of organizations doing, like I know WCS does, is as this data is coming in, they might have a data manager who's actively monitoring these submissions and cleaning this data as it comes in. So sometimes, ooh, that doesn't look right. There's an option to inspect the data, to clean the data, to make adjustments if something wasn't caught. And in that way, this can become a nice kind of basic data management tool. But Kobo is very limited in terms of what actual reports and analysis you can do. So a lot of times folks, what they'll do is they'll just export the Kobo data, what you see in that table, and run their reporting on Excel or SPSS or what other tools you're doing. The other option is to automatically extract this and integrate it with some sort of application or another system using OpenFN. And so that's where we get back to those two options. The one being where OpenFN can send a request and pull data from Kobo. The other one being there is this setting called REST service where you can choose to forward data. So I can choose to forward data to OpenFN, and then I can specify my specific OpenFN's project address and URL. So that option to you all is there. That's great for real time. We're not going to talk about that today because it does not send cleaned data. So as I mentioned, if you're collecting data in Kobo and then you're cleaning it regularly through this interface, as soon as you clean it, that updated submission does not get sent through that forwarding option. So that's where we are rather today going to show you this approach where you can pool data via OpenFN. But if you wanted to set up this option, it's there for you. It's also a really common option in ODK and ONA and things like that. If you look for something like REST service or webhook, that will provide you some documentation on how to do that. But any quick questions here on Kobo Toolbox? James, I know you specifically were asking about extracting data. Anything from your side?
No, that all sounds good. That all makes sense. I'm interested to see how you do the reverse, how you get open function to kind of grab it. That will be really interesting.
Cool. But yeah, our open function doc site, as well as a lot of these applications, do typically have their own documentation on how to do the first. So if you're working with ONA, you can search for ONA webhook or ONA REST service and probably find something. But we'll talk about today, like, how do we get data via open function? And so to do that, what we're going to do is focus here on the left, where we're going to have this job in open function that's going to get data via the Kobo API. So when we're interacting with an API, there's very specific types of responses or requests that we can ask. Usually get is what we say when we want to extract data. Post is when we want to create data in application. Patch is usually to update data in application. But if you're looking at an application's API documentation, they'll tell you, how exactly you should be extracting data. But what we're going to do is we're going to open up open function, and we're going to actually get data for a specific form. And what these jobs that are set up in open function do is that they can be set up to run on demand. So today I can say, hey, go get my survey data that I've collected for the last month and pull that in. Or I can say, I want to set this up on a schedule. So every week, every day, every 3 hours, I want to pull information from Kobo and check for new submissions. And so I'm going to flip over to open function. But the first thing that you need to know before pulling data is you need to make sure you understand which forms you're pulling from. So if you all can see my screen, we here have these
Screen stopped again. Can you reshare?
Oh, okay.
Sometimes it's off.
Seems like it doesn't like Kobo. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
it's good.
Fantastic. So when we want to sync a form from Kobo, again, you might have multiple forms that you're collecting. What's important to know is exactly which form you want to pull data from. And how we determine that is you actually click into the form that you want. And you'll see forms have these names, which are these like text labels. You can name your form whatever you'd like. But in the URL here, there's an actual ID, a unique identifier that's assigned to every form. And so if you're going to be pulling information from a specific form, it's helpful to know, like, what is your form called? But also, what is that unique ID, that unique address to where this form sits on your Kobo account? And if you have these two pieces of information, you can tell open function, hey, here's where my Kobo account lives. Here's my specific form that I want to fetch information from. And here's the time period that I want to fetch that information for. And then open function can take those three pieces and then send a GET request to Kobo to then pull data into open function. And so even if none of that makes sense to you, the key takeaway is know your form and know your form data here. And if you have those two tidbits, you can follow the nice documentation that we have kind of walking you through this. But in your ConSoSci project, if you all also have this open with me, there are a couple jobs in there that say fetch. So for example, we have this fifth job, A5, that's fetching form data. And if I click into this job, I can see that this job is fetching form responses. It runs every 3 hours. the credential that it's linked to, the little key there, is it's linked to this WCS Kobo account that I have set up that I was just showing you all on my screen. And it's using HTTP to communicate with Kobo. So it's using HTTP to send these HTTP requests. And then in these job itself, there's a lot more going on than what you'll need to deal with. But the main thing that you'll be focusing on is specifying what surveys you want to pool. And so there's more code in here that's specifying what to do when OpenFN gets those surveys. And when OpenFN gets those surveys, it starts processing that information and loading into your inbox. But if you're using the solution for the first time, if you know your form name and your form ID, you can add a survey entry here and simply specify your form ID, what form you're pulling, and if you want to go ahead and start mapping it to another table, you might also specify the destination that you're mapping it to. So remember, in this context, we're always syncing this data with databases. So here we're specifying the destination table that we want to map this database to. But you know, so long as you know your form and your form type, you can then specify that in the job and then choose the job to run. So what that looks like if, for example, I also have this other form going on, I might copy my form ID. I might then edit my job here to then specify another survey. So I'm going to specify the form's unique identifier, UID. I'm going to specify the type of form. So what information am I collecting? Is this sharks and rays? Is this basic necessities? And this one, it was a swim marché survey. And then where am I mapping this data to? So maybe I'm mapping this data to a table called swim marché, something like that. So however your database is configured, you might specify that. But as soon as we have that form ID, form type, and your table name specified, you can just hit save. And this is the only interaction you need to do with OpenFN to get data is you take one of these get jobs that are already there, you specify the survey. OpenFN is then going to take that survey and it's going to send a bunch of requests or queries to this Kobo URL, and it's going to say, hey, Kobo, give me data for these surveys. And what you can do is you can, again, set this up to run on a timer, or you can just click play next to the job to run this job now. And once you do that, if you go back to your inbox, you'll start to see submissions coming in. So if you all see my timer up here on the right, it's 4:44 here in Riga. And so I can see that we've had some data come in. So if I click into one of these messages and I actually check out the message body, I can see, okay, looks like here is very specific Kobo data that came in. And I see this one came from my swim marché form. And here is the actual submission. So if I go to my swim marché data in Kobo, and if I open up the table here, can you all still see my screen with Kobo?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Kobo will give every submission usually some sort of ID or answer ID. So here I can see each row is a different form or survey response collected via Kobo. And here in my message, I see that I have this ID 8527379. And looks like, oh, here's the second row of data. And if I clicked into the second row of data and I inspected it, here's what it looks like when I'm looking at it in Kobo. So on the left, I can see here all the different questions that were asked in the survey. And on the right, I can see the responses. when we look at data in OpenFunction, it's a similar view, but it's just in that JSON format. So here in the message, I can see everything in black are the different questions or data points that were collected for a submission. So what market, if there were wild meat vendors, when the survey was taken. And on the right is where I can see the actual data values, the responses. And so when we ran that job to get data, it took those IDs, sent those requests, and then boom, 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 lots of individual messages for you to then click around and explore, okay, here's what the structure of my data looks like. Now I can figure out this next step of loading it to another system. And you can, ultimately automate this entire pipeline end to end. But the very basic steps of just getting data are know your Kobo form name and form ID. In OpenFunction, you go to one of these fetch jobs, and then you can just follow the syntax here to specify your ID, your form name, and where you maybe ultimately want to map that data. And then you just run the job, and it will load information into your inbox for you all to check out and to figure out where to process onwards. So I'm going to pause here for any quick questions.
So this job has fetched the data, but it hasn't, I don't know what the term would be, but posted it to anywhere else, has it yet?
No, not yet.
Okay. So it's just like in some like middle space, cyberspace, ready to be ported somewhere.
Secure OpenFunction inbox ready to port it somewhere.
Gotcha.
So when you all signed up for OpenFunction, you got your own project, as well as we gave you access to this training project. So if you click into the training project, you'll see exactly what I'm seeing here. Every project has its own inbox, so its own unique address. And so when we talked about projects last week, we talked about this might be a way for you to group your solutions or your data. So if you have lots of people working on the same types of surveys and survey submission data, you might all be in one project. So that way you can fetch data for all of those surveys. So if you have a team working on the Sharks and Rays data collection, you might all have the Sharks and Rays project that you're accessing where you're getting that data, loading into this OpenFunction inbox, where OpenFunction will just temporarily store this for you. So that way you can figure out how to map it onwards to other destination systems. And you can set up your entire extract load pipeline to be end-to-end. So that way, there isn't that kind of multi-step flow. It can be a lot more of a synchronous flow, or some organizations have requirements where they don't want to be saving any data in the inbox. So that's all configurable. But usually when we go about these, we leverage the inbox as a way for us to inspect the data that we get from Kobo, so we can figure out how to design that integration next step.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a question with regard to the forms that are being fetched. When you've already set up the job and it fetches the information, does it fetch just the most recent data that has been sent, or do you get all the data that has been sent that is linked to that specific unique ID, the form that you've selected?
Great question.
Do you get all?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. And so you have options. So we have a couple of these template jobs that are available. Some are set up in a way to kind of keep what we call a cursor or some sort of bookmark. So if I fetch data this morning at 10 a.m., the next time I fetch data 2 hours from now, I only want to fetch anything new. So anything that was submitted in that 2-hour window. In that case, you might have this cursor that automatically updates and will then only fetch the most recent submissions. And you can see when you're looking at a timer job, there's something called, in JavaScript, a term is really popular, it's called state. So the last state of the data, or the last job run, we last ran it at 4:44. And so the next time this job runs, it's going to pick up from where that job left off. And so in that way, you might choose to only incrementally sync new submissions, but you can also choose to override this, and you can just pool data all time. And so we won't get too much into that today, but can certainly point you to documentation where there are two options where you might want to incrementally pull data, and then there's some where you might want to do this historical all-time pool. And depending on your use case, there might be benefits to either. I'm not sure, Remy, if you had anything specifically in mind.
Oh, what I was thinking was maybe you've had people collecting data before you've set up your jobs. So you have a lot of data that has already been collected in the Kobo. And when you want to fetch all the data that has collected, and also it will have this program where it keeps on fetching intermittently with time. So I was wondering whether it would fetch all the data that was collected prior to you setting it up, so that when, yeah. I don't know.
Absolutely, and it looks like this job actually has it already. You'll see usually in those jobs there'll be something called like a cursor, where then you can specify that point in time. So you can say anything after January 1st or whatever, how historical far back that goes, then you can pull that data. And what OpenFN will do is it'll take that cursor, and then that request that it sends to OpenFN, it'll add that to the query. So it says, hey Kobo, give me this survey ID, but also filter where the end date begins with that. So again, there are some of these like template jobs. You can choose to use the one that's set up just to pull regularly. You can choose to use the one that was set up historically, but I think the WCS team did this. They had all these basic necessity surveys where back to 2017 there was data. So we pooled all of that historical information from 2017 to present day using this historical fetch job. So we said everything after January 1st, 2017. And then on an ongoing basis, we've configured a job to run on a timer. So every 3 hours, please continue to check for new submissions.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks.
And Remy, to add to that, what we also do is with OpenFN, we don't have to worry about when people have cleaned data upstream. So in other words, the approach we had before where people downloaded data into Excel, they would have no idea if someone could clean data upstream. But what's elegant about the OpenFN solution is the data is flowing into your database. If someone makes a correction upstream to a historic set of data, that just flows down automatically as well. So that's another beautiful feature about this solution.
Yeah, that's great. Nice, thanks.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but when we load data to another application, we always want to try to do it in a way where that load process is repeatable. So trying to make sure we have some sort of like duplicate checking step, or a lot of times what we call an upsert operation, where we first check if the record's existing, and then we will either insert if the record is not, or update if the record is, so that insert or update becomes this term upsert. So you'll see in some of the database jobs that we look at today, there are a lot of these upsert operations, and what it's doing is using some sort of identifier to say, hey, does this record already exist? If so, then I don't want to make sure I'm creating duplicates. So that's a little bit of that upstream flow that Jonathan was alluding to.
Good. It sounds good that you can be able to adapt the code according to like the situation you're in. So that's really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say if you're wanting to try this out, Remy, taking advantage of some of these initial fetch jobs, it's a good start. But if you ever had questions, we can certainly customize it or help you customize to your use case, because the jobs are very configurable. So usually, if you have very specific requirements of how you want to pull or load data, we can usually adapt these solutions to meet that.
Good. Thanks.
Awesome. Any other questions here? All right, well, can you still see my slides, everyone?
Yes.
Awesome. So what we just did is we just walked through that timer job. So if you have your form ID, you have your form name, you take one of these existing open function fetch jobs, you just plug in your ID, click run, or you set up that timer to run. And for those of you that use database jobs and such before, timers are run on cron, so you can specify a very specific schedule that you want those jobs to run. So you can do every minute, every day, every hour, but you can also spread it out so that way, you know, it's once a month or something that maybe aligns better with your different reporting periods. So that's all on timer jobs. And what we've done at this stage now is we've fetched this data and we've now loaded it into this inbox. So now we've done that first step of getting data. So next, what we want to talk about is, okay, great. Like now that we have got this data, how do we get it into another system? And that's where we'll typically have a second job, where you then load that data into another data system. So if you all are in ConSoSci training project, there's a lot of jobs to look at, but there's a couple really, really simple ones here. And if you see here, what we do in a job is when I'm editing a job, it will open up this whole view for me here. And we specify the name of the job. We specify what triggers that job. So are we running this job on a timer? Is this job triggered when a certain event happens or when we receive a certain type of data? What system are we loading the data to? So am I connecting to a database? Am I connecting to another application? We want to make sure that we provide OpenFunction some authorization to get in there. And then what type of application? Am I accessing, you know, a PostgreSQL database, some MSQL? Am I using HTTP to write to another application? And if you check out all these different OpenFunction adapters, there's lots of different options for types of applications that you might be connecting with. But pretty much most web applications can connect over this HTTP. And then there's some database specific connectors there. But once you've defined the name of your job, what triggers the job, you know, where that job is sending data to, that's where the job gets to work and defining what should happen. So we're going to get a lot more into this in the coming days for those of you that want to know how to write jobs. We'll talk a lot more about like how do you actually build these from scratch? How do you edit these? But at its core, you know, what a job does is it says some sort of operation in the system that you're accessing. So you might be upserting data. So if, you know, check if it's existing. If we do, we insert. If we don't, we update. You might just insert data. You might also insert tables, like actual metadata that you can configure. So when you're working with an OpenFunction connector, it gives you all these different operations. But jobs, you define the operation. What am I doing in that system? And then you specify the parameters to that operation and that action. So here I might be updating a very specific Kobo table. I'm looking up existing records using some sort of unique ID. And then I'm mapping data points. And when we say mapping, what we're saying is we're taking data received from Kobo, and we're saying, how should those data values appear in my destination system? So on the left here, I have all of these columns in my database that I want to map to. And I'm telling OpenFunction where to pull that data from. And on the left, we can actually see here's again another message that just appears side by side when you're looking at a job. And we can see information like, okay, great, here Kobo tells us there's that JSON key value pair again. There's that landing site question, and there's an actual data value. And so I can check out and see what that looks like and then decide how to map that to my database. And if I was going to keep editing these jobs, I can just continue to add other data elements that I want to assign. So for example, if I wanted to specify the surveyor's name, I might add that as a mapping. And then I would just specify where in the Kobo form does that come from. And I can see here Kobo on the left tells me surveyor is what the data value is called. And that's kind of how a job is begun to be built. So stay tuned if you want to learn more. That's going to come up in the coming days of how we customize jobs. But for those of you who are not working on setting this up, want to leverage some of the automated solutions, just know that a job, again, performs a series of tasks or operations in a database. If you want to have a sense of what that job is doing, you can click in and check out the main operations. And then you can see the parameters and the actual, specific attributes that we might be setting or modifying in a connected system. So any quick questions on jobs here?
About the trigger, can you explain what a cron is?
Yeah, good question. So cron is like a language that is used for specifying, in database terms. Usually, when you want to automate a certain task, you might use cron to schedule when that task happens. So if I'm an open function and I wanted to create a new timer where I wanted a job to run, let's say every day or every few minutes, if I created a new trigger, I can call this my new timer trigger, run daily, and I might choose to schedule my job by using cron. And for those of us like myself who have not worked with cron before OpenFunction, there's this little link that OpenFunction will show you kind of how you can set up this timer. And so if I can then specify at what minute, at what hour, at what day of the month, and you can use this to define a schedule. And so let's say I wanted to run this at midnight on the first day of every month, then I can just copy that and put that there. So high level, cron is just how you schedule a job. The details of it is there's this little link to this tool that tells you how to write these very specific expressions. But if you're working with databases, this might be a little bit more familiar.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so then you can have all these different timers set up. And so then you can have all these different timers set to these different jobs. Or you might have some jobs that are waiting and listening for certain data to come in and then run as soon as that data is received. So here on my screen, we can see some other triggers too. Like for example, we have this one where anytime data comes in where there's this tag that it's from a BNS survey, that might trigger a job. You might also have something like, okay, whenever a form name is sharks and rays, that might trigger a job. Triggers are these little listeners that just kind of wait for either a schedule or incoming data to your inbox to then execute a job and activate the job. And so those really dictate, when are you processing data. Any other quick questions? Awesome. Can you all see my slides still?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So that was a lot of information. But what we just talked about was, how do we write these jobs how do we, use these jobs to fetch data? That was that first job where we just took the survey ID, plugged it into the job, fetched data to load those JSON messages into our inbox. And then the second is we just took a quick look at a job that might then load data into a database. So if you're doing your own setup, want to map to your own custom database, have a very specific database structure, you might choose to leverage either some of these existing jobs that have been used on past projects before to write your own jobs, both your own Git jobs as well as your own upload jobs. You might use some other solutions jobs to just tweak and borrow the code and reuse it and adapt it to your context. But for those of us that don't want anything to do with jobs or don't want to be writing jobs from scratch, we have this solution that will allow you to plug in these form IDs, and OpenFN will automatically generate these jobs for you. OpenFN will automatically take care of the integration for you, as well as make changes to your database system. So I'm going to give a quick overview of kind of just recapping what this solution does. Then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we're going to actually walk through how does it look to plug in some of these form IDs, and then start syncing the data, syncing the database. So to start, if you all remember this slide here, we talked about these different use cases that we have these different template solutions for. So what we're focusing on today is this more rapid deployment setup. Cool, OpenFN's great. I know I can connect with everything, but I need to get this survey into my database now, today. And maybe I don't even have someone on my team who's very familiar with databases. So this is the solution that's kind of more set up for those folks. It's still leveraging OpenFN and these core building blocks and jobs to do this pooling and loading of data between systems. But what it's going to allow you to do is just at a couple points enter in what forms you want to run, and OpenFN will do the heavy lifting for you. And the idea being that if you, at the very least, have a Kobo form set up where you're hoping to collect data, and you have an existing, if you have a database, the database does not need to be configured, but you do need a database somewhere. So there are lots of open source options where you can very quickly, deploy a database and set it up on your computer. You can set it up on the cloud. If your organization's using Microsoft offers their own kind of SQL database options. And as soon as you create that database, there might not be any tables or columns or any data model defined, and that's absolutely fine. So long as you have that instance of that database, and you have that form that you want to integrate with, then you can choose to run the solution. And what the solution is going to do, it's going to read that Kobo form and says, what questions are you asking? And based off of those questions that you're asking in that form, it's going to create this data model and actually configure tables and columns in your database. And then once that database is set up, once that infrastructure is set up, OpenFN will also create a job that will be set up to start syncing to that data model. And so after a few clicks, what you'll get is from a Kobo form to having a data model to map to, as well as an integration that is ready to be turned on when you're ready. And so that's what we're going to come back and focus on for the second half of the session, is just like how do you go from that Kobo form to these two different outputs, and then at a very high level talk about what some other options are, but certainly stay tuned for some of the later sessions in which we're going to get a lot more into detail of how you might customize this to adapt to your needs, which might be more interesting to any folks that already have a database system or a very specific data model they want to map to, rather than having OpenFN come up with this data model for you. That's something that we will get into a little bit down the line today. But I'm going to pause here and just if there's any last questions. Otherwise, I recommend that let's take a quick 5-minute break, and then we can come back and kind of get into the solution setup. So any quick questions here?
Cool, we're ready for our break, I think.
Okay, awesome. Well, then let's meet back here in 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. Was troubleshooting some audio things. Fantastic. Great. Well, hoping everyone is back. I'm going to show you my screen again. And we're going to get our hands dirty, and my colleague Rita is going to be helping us out as well, just kind of walking through the solution. But if you all can see my screen, let me know.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So great. So now we have this Kobo form, and we want to get it into a database, and we want to build that integration around it. So what we're going to do is just walk through this step by step, and we're going to show you how it's done. But then there's going to be a chance for you all to also to give it a try, or to suggest some forms that maybe we can sync. But how this works in a little bit more detail is that OpenFN is going to analyze your Kobo form definition. And for those of you that are familiar with Kobo forms or other similar data collection tools, you might be interested in how OpenFN generates this data model. So there's a lot of documentation that goes into the specifics just around how OpenFN takes the form definition and then loads, generates this data model to load the data in. But usually, there's this information you're capturing for every form or every survey you're collecting. So you might always be capturing who is conducting that survey, when that survey is done, just some key data points about that form. But Kobo allows us to also configure these groups of questions that, depending on certain responses, these different groups of questions might appear. And so for sharks and rays, if you're collecting information about that, you might ask folks if they procured certain species in a market, or do they actually catch it on a boat, for an example. So if you're interviewing folks that are catching sharks and rays via a boat, you might want to ask questions about these boats that they're catching these species from. So you might say, hey, how many boats, and what is your boat type, and what type of crew did you have on this boat? So you might start to fill out your form to fill out these groups of questions that are specific to whatever you're collecting information on. And how Kobo structures this is that it will call these question groups, but if you might repeat these questions multiple times. So for example, if you are asking someone, how many boats did you have to catch your species? So they might say, I had 3 boats. You might ask these questions multiple times. You might repeat these questions. So your first group of answers might be, okay, for boat 1, it was a dhow boat, and we had 2 crew members on board. And for that boat, we caught these types of sharks. But for boat 2, that's a second way that, second boat that you're capturing information on, you'll repeat that groups of questions. You might collect, more information on that boat. And so what happens a lot of times is when we use Kobo and these different data collection tools, it's not a very flat data structure in that survey. Like, yes, it's one survey, it's one form, but a lot of times there's lots of nested information happening there, where we have one form with many boats, and those boats might have many catches that they're telling us about. And so we could decide to map this data to just kind of one database table, but to optimize analysis, particularly when there are many boats, many details, many entries about certain questions. We then prefer to kind of map this data to a slightly more structured database that allows us to capture these relationships between these different data elements. And so for those of you all who are interested in the database side and how this all works, there's a standard data model configuration format that OpenFN will use when it analyzes your Kobo form. So if in your Kobo form, we see that there are these different question groupings, OpenFunction will then generate this data model that structures your data in that way to capture these one-to-many relationships. So you have one survey form for which you're capturing details on many boats, and each boat might have many catches. And so in that way, by looking at the Kobo form, we can almost infer relationships between these different data elements, like your form, your boat, your catch. And from there, kind of begin to build a data model that will be slightly more optimized for analysis or running queries if you're doing that on the database side. But even if you're not familiar with that type of stuff, you're working with databases for the first time, this provides essentially a template data model that will be can be automatically configured based off of whatever your Kobo form looks like. So in the documentation, there's a lot more details on like what that standard convention is, but no matter what your form looks like, you might have no groups, you might have many groups, you might have nested groups of questions. OpenFunction will do that analysis and then generate a corresponding data model. And that's the one big takeaway from the solution is that you have a form, but no database to capture it. OpenFunction is going to analyze that form, come up with this data model, and then can also choose to actually configure that in your database if you'd like. There is the option not to configure it automatically, but rather to see how OpenFunction would configure it. That way you have a chance to manipulate it before anything is actually being changed in your database. But it does provide you this kind of really quick way to set up that destination system. So that's part one of the automation solution. Any quick questions here on a high level? Awesome. So once we have this database configured, the next step in the automation solution is, okay, cool, I analyzed the Kobo form, I created a database, but now we need to actually connect Kobo with that database that we just set up. So we need to set up some sort of ongoing integration or data sync. And the second part of this is that OpenFunction will analyze that same form, and it will automatically create a job or this integration script for you. So if you don't want to learn a lot about OpenFunction or get your hands too dirty, you can still, just by identifying a form, you can both configure a database as well as have this integration script auto-generated. And what that allows you to do is really quickly not only make sure your database is set up, but then you can go ahead and start syncing data. And if you stick with the default data model that OpenFunction has provided, then you don't need to actually make any changes to this job, but rather just go through some steps to turn on the job, to connect the job to the right system that you want to be working with. But other than that, you'll get something like what you see on my screen, where OpenFunction has identified, okay, here are the different tables we're mapping to. I'm mapping to a Kobo dataset table. I want to log that this form submission happened. I'm logging details about the sharks and rays, form submission, the surveyor, the market, the landing site. I then want to upsert information about boats. So the boat info, boat type, crew. And so that script is automatically saying how that Kobo data should begin to map to that database that we just set up here. So that's the second big output is is this integration, whereas the first is the actual metadata setup for this solution. Any quick questions here? Cool. Well, let's get to it and then actually see how it works. So things you should know before you dive into this. There is a little bit of setup outside of what we're talking about today, and just things for you all to consider. Step one is, do you have a Kobo form to integrate? So hands up if anyone here does not have a Kobo form to integrate today. Maybe your organization isn't using Kobo, maybe you don't have a Kobo account. Do you mind just putting a quick hand up if you don't have a Kobo form? Awesome.
I don't have one, but I'm sure I can borrow one from one of my colleagues.
Okay. Well, if you don't, there's also this link that I'll drop in the chat where you can actually go and find all of these Kobo forms that are available to you. But we also have an account set up today that I'll give you access to in a moment. Rita, do you mind actually dropping the credentials in the chat?
Yeah, yep.
But Rita's going to share with you all credentials where you can log into this Kobo project that I'm looking at in here. So there's a username and a password, and when you log in, you'll see what I see here. So you can see the forms we have here. You can also choose to add your own forms if you want to add forms, or if you want to test out a form you might already have. You can share it with our WCS_training user. So Rita will drop those details in the chat. We'll come back to that. But assuming you have a Kobo form to integrate, and if not, maybe borrowing one from the ConSoSci library of forms, using one of the ones that we have now. We then ask, do you have a database already configured? If you already have some sort of a database configured, we recommend, when you're testing this out to use maybe a development environment or some sort of staging database before you're running all this automation on real data. A recommendation to get that set up. But if not, there are lots of easy, quick ways to just kind of quickly set up and deploy one. So Postgres, if you just Google Postgres database, you can set that up locally. You can set that up on a cloud instance. I know with some other ConSoSci solutions in the work, there might be some more materials and guidance just around database setup. But for today, we have a demo database that we'll be connecting within this OpenFN project. So for today, if you don't have a Kobo form, if you don't have a database, no worries, we have you covered. But generally, that's what you do need to get started. You need to know, what is my source and what is my destination? Again, that database does not need to be configured, but it needs to exist, and it needs to be set up on some sort of server, whether that's you're doing it locally on your computer, or if you're using a service like Google Cloud Platform or Microsoft to quickly spin up an instance of a database. Those inputs and that final output needs to be there, so that way OpenFN can get to work of extracting and then loading between the two. So any quick questions here? Awesome. Well, for those of you, I think Rita dropped this in the chat as well. If you go to kf.kobotoolbox.org, we can log in with these credentials, WCS training, and that password there. So you can log in with this account just to see exactly what I'm seeing. You can also, if you already have your own Kobo form that you want to try this out with, you can share that Kobo form with that user, WCS_training. And if you share your form with that user, then it'll appear in our training account. And then you can see that here. So if I
share together with submissions, then we can also see data from it.
And Rita, how is sharing done? Is it share project here?
Yes, it is share project. And then add user.
Got it. And so then I can share a form with WCS training, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And then select which permissions you want to add. So view submissions, edit form are useful so that we can access it.
Okay. Great. So can everyone drop a quick chat once you're logged into Kobo Toolbox?
Cool, and we also got a form shared.
Anyone having any trouble accessing Kobo Toolbox? Remy, how's it going your side? Oh, there you go. Jesse, Wulan, how are you all doing?
So I have it in the library. Is that all I need to do?
Yeah, so have you logged into Kobo Toolbox?
Yes, I have a login, and then I
Okay.
can find the library with all of that. Sorry,
Awesome.
with the
So
ConSoSci.
yeah, so if you see this, what you can choose to do if you want to use one of these forms is you can choose to download one of these forms and then set it up on Kobo. So how you might do that is when you click into one of these forms, if you see on my screen, there's that more actions, and then there's this download XLS option. And if I click that, it will then download this Excel version of this form.
Okay.
And then what I can do is I can go to the library and I click new.
I think
And I can just
on a different window. Could you switch over to that, because we're seeing the WCS one.
oh, sorry. I don't know what's going on with the screen sharing today. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there we go. We are at the library.
Awesome. So you have all these different forms in the library. So if you hit this little ... more actions, you can choose to then download that form. And I think, Diane, can you also just clone this? Do you know?
Yeah, I did clone that, but
Yeah, you can clone it.
Okay.
And then it goes, when you clone it, it goes under your projects.
Got it. So then I can call this Alexa's Sharks and Rays. And if
Yeah.
I clone that, then it will show up in my library. So then if I go back to...
Yeah, you go to your project and the,
yeah, what I did previously is
Right.
just clone it. Is that the same thing?
it should be there in your draft. Why is it in there? Oh no, there you go. Sorry, yeah. Then you have to do the build. Yeah, this you can go to the new under the projects where you were before. Not the library, the project. New build from scratch. You give the title. Yeah. And then you will be in the add from library, yes button. And you have the block that you saved. You just drag this block in the middle. Yeah.
Got it. So Wulan, it looks like, did you follow that? Because otherwise I know you can also download and then re-upload as well.
Yeah, it works.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, it might be quicker actually to just import, download the XLS and re-upload it. The library functions of Kobo are not really great yet, but they are working on it.
Yeah, so I can also click new and I can choose to upload XLS and choose that form there. So James, I think you said y'all are already working on ODK. You might try uploading your ODK forms here just to see if that works. I don't know offhand if that directly translates, but that would be a quick test to see if you can quickly move over your ODK forms to Kobo.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
Cool. Well, once you have your different forms set up in your Kobo project, or maybe you're choosing to use one of the existing ones that we have here, the first step is just identifying what that form looks like. So Rita, maybe I'll switch over to you to kind of walk us through this next step process.
Sure. So you can see my screen. So once now you have the first necessary prerequisites, you have a Kobo form to sync. At this point, there's a small health check to do. So if you're on your form in the Kobo project, you have the title up here. So one thing that before you start the integration, just check the form name. Make sure it's unique. Make sure it's not too long. So ideally not exceeding 25 characters. Also, Alexa mentioned the different sections within the form. So specifically the repeat group. So if we're back into the sharks and rays data collection form, and you might have sections to collect data from about the boat with which the catch was made. So as these are going to be mapped into database tables, also make sure that these section names, these repeat group names are relatively short, that they're unique. And also make sure that the form names, so the name of the Kobo form, the project name, doesn't begin with a number and doesn't contain any special characters like a dash or a parentheses. So here's a good example for a Kobo form to even contain numbers. It just doesn't begin with a number. So this is just a general health check that you need to do before you start integration.
Yeah, so remember, OpenFunction's analyzing your form to create this database setup. So if you have like a form group name that is super long, you're going to have this database table with this ridiculously long name. And these databases also have limits on how long certain table names can be, column names can be. So if you're intending to sync a Kobo form using the solution, you might just do this quick cleaning check of your form of, how do I name these sections in my forms? How long is my form? And kind of, get rid of any weird special characters, just make sure things are a bit more short and descriptive. So you might have sharks and rays, boats, catch details, and just keep it nice and clean. And then that will map to corresponding data tables and that way. Where you have sharks and rays boat, sharks and rays catch details, rather than some incredibly long string. So that's something just to keep in mind, is if you are about to run a Kobo form through, just think about, if you're going to connect it to a database, how to optimize your form in a way so that that database output looks nice and clean.
So the other big decision that you need to make before you start integration is whether you have two options when you integrate. You add your Kobo form and actually start actually want to run it through the solution. You can Alexa mentions that these open function jobs are creating these SQL scripts that create tables, update tables, create database cons. So you have two options when running the solution. You can either execute these SQL scripts automatically on the database. So once you've added your Kobo form and you start the integration, it will connect to the database and execute. So it will connect and create and update the tables. If you just first want to test, or if you want to make any modifications, the details and the use cases for which we're going to in the next session, then you have the option to just write the SQL script. So you can just access the logs of the SQL script, look at how it looks without actually executing them in the database.
Yeah, so this is an important point, particularly if you're mapping to an existing database. If you say execute true, when this runs, OpenFunction is going to reconfigure your database. So if you don't want to give OpenFunction that power to create these tables for you, but if you want a little bit more control, or if you want to maybe slightly modify the configuration before it's executed, you can still use this solution to generate these SQL scripts that you can then choose to run on demand yourself, or tweak slightly before you run on demand. So that gives database administrators, power to manipulate the default output and maybe remodel what OpenFunction is suggesting based off of the form. But if you're not comfortable with SQL, if you're not working with databases for the first time, but yeah, do want to give OpenFunction this control, like, yes, come on, like, go ahead and configure this database for me, then you might turn that execute on to true, and then it will just make those changes automatically.
So now we have all the pieces together to run the solutions, the solution and see all the steps in the chain. So on a high level, what happens is that the project admin can define on OpenFunction exactly which forms from Kobo they want to sync. Then once this is defined in the job, OpenFN will go and extract from Kobo new forms and add any updated Kobo forms. So here we're talking about the form definition, the form name, the questions, the repeat group questions. So these are going to determine how the database will look like. These are going to determine which tables and which columns are going to be written in the database. So it sets up the infrastructure for then syncing the data. So at this point, you're going to have access to the SQL script, which defines how to create the database table and the database columns. So these are also auto-generated. And also, OpenFunction creates the job that will take the actual Kobo submission data, the survey responses, and write them into the database columns that were just created in the previous step. So I will pause here for a second for any questions.
Yeah, Rita, if maybe just keeping that screenshot up really quickly. So if you all are poking around the OpenFunction project, that slide 33, you'll see there's all these jobs set up for you. So if you're running this, you can set up these jobs in your own project or in another project you're working on with another partner. but you're going to have these 4 jobs that we're describing here. And there's one job that you're going to be editing to input information. So you're going to tell OpenFunction, hey, what forms do I want to run the solution with? And then OpenFunction is going to trigger all these other jobs that are going to give you 2 outputs. So that's what Rita was describing, was the SQL script and then the OpenFunction job. So if you're looking at the ConSoSci project, that's what you see there. So yeah, Rita, should we dive in?
Yes, let's look at it on the project. So here I switched over to OpenFunction. I'm in the ConSoSci project, and I'm looking at the jobs that we have set up here. So just as described before, the first job called 8.1 find updated Kobo forms is the one where you can define exactly which Kobo form you want to check for and create or update the database for. So if I click into that, right in the beginning, we see the relevant part where you can define which Kobo forms you need. So if you switch over to Kobo, we have the Kobo form ID up in the URL. So this is the identifier that you need to copy from here and add to the job.
So I'm going to paste in the chat what this looks like. But what you need to input to that first job to tell OpenFunction is you're going to need that form UID. Then you'll see there's these two options, P1 and P2, and then table ID. So this is just kind of a way to define how the table should be called in your database. So with WCS, for example, they always use organization name as that first prefix, P1. And then they'll use P2 as a way of maybe grouping forms. So they'll say this is all sharks and rays forms, or this is all BNS forms, basic necessity surveys forms. So these prefix give you the option to just create these standard namespaces in your database, which I know a lot of organizations find really helpful when you have a database with lots of forms and tables, and they might not necessarily be related. It allows you to kind of group that metadata a little bit. And then lastly, the table ID, that's the meat of it. That's what you actually want your destination table to be called. So if you're mapping sharks and rays data, your table might be called sharks and rays. You might call it something else. You might call it sharks data. Sharks are cool, however you want it. But that's kind of that decision that you're making as you are configuring this database through the automation solution, but you're configuring this database. So you need to decide kind of like how you want your database metadata to look. And so the suggestion is kind of following this format where it's, the form ID, your organization name, the form type, and then a name for the form or the table. So if you all have a form picked out.
Hey, Alexa, just to add, those 2 prefixes, prefix 1 and 2, they don't only help you organize the tables in your database so you can find them. It also there's some other advantages there as well. So for example, if someone creates a form that's about people, that's a very generic name, but by having these 2 sets of prefix, what is the organization, or what is your first level prefix and the second, it avoids you having somebody creating a form that's for a very local project and giving a name that confuses people about what it is. In other words, having a form and you're having someone who's written a form for one specific project and it takes a table called people in your database would confuse people because they'll be looking at the people table. But if that table is called WCS underscore Amazon Waters project underscore people, then it's not going to be confusing for people what it's about. So it allows you to have 10 people could have a different people table, for example, that's specific to their own project.
I have a quick question. So in the case of a Kobo toolbox form that inherent in the form are really kind of multiple relationships between tables, this table ID, how will it reflect the multiple tables in that Kobo form that like you would want the data to be mapped to?
Great question. So Rita will pull up on the screen the diagram of that. But while we're answering this question, if you all have a Kobo form ready, you'll see in the chat I dropped kind of that naming convention. If you want to copy that and fill that in with your form, so like fill in the form ID, fill in your organization name, fill in the form type, and maybe give your table a name. And if you want to chat back to me that new little set of attributes, then we can actually plug your form into the solution, so you can all see how that works. So if you take a look at the chat, you can go ahead and just kind of fill in those placeholders while Rita pulls this up. So your question was how do we take these like related tables and map it? So Rita, do you want to walk us through like the name spacing here?
So on the highest level, the main table name here is the one that we can define in the job. So if I switch back to there here, if we have a form name called Sharks and Rays, we want to map it to the main table, the Sharks and Rays form. So if I switch back to the job here, this is the main table ID that you can define here.
And then with repeat groups, Rita?
So under that, you have the repeat group sections in the form. So for example, in Sharks and Rays, you have a repeat group for both, which is going to be under structurally under the main table ID that you defined, and it's going to be automatically created in a way that like the repeat group name is appended with an underscore.
So just the appending that name there, and so that's why if you have a really long repeat group name, your table names become really unruly. So this is where that recommendation of, hey, really think about what you want those groups to be called, because that's defining your metadata. And then not only does the table names are that, but when these tables are automatically created, relationships are also created. So if you're familiar with databases, there will be like a foreign key, primary key link between these tables.
Wow. Okay. No, this is excellent. So are there character limitations in the naming? Okay. So we would want to be aware of those. Cool. And would we want to follow the syntax, like underscore as the separator and whatnot?
So when you read it, maybe if you go back to that job one where we're actually inputting this. So by default, if you're defining that prefix 1, prefix 2 table ID, it's going to just concatenate those and separate that by underscores. So it'll be ConSoSci underscore SR underscore your table ID. And then your table ID underscore whatever those repeat group names are. But by default, it configures everything in camel case. So this is definitely the stuff if you're really interested in like the database configuration specs and all that. Definitely encourage you to check out the docs, because we detail that exactly how it outputs the metadata, as well as Kobo has all sorts of question types. So how those question types get outputted as different database column types and data types. So for example, if you have, you know, a text string versus a number, it outputs as like an integer column. So you can kind of see what that default configuration is, and then start to think ahead. Do you want to keep that default, or do you want to adjust that to fit your own database conventions?
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks for explaining. I'll check the documentation for the more detailed questions. Thank you.
Awesome. So Rita, I see we have a couple in the chat from Diane and Charlotte. Maybe we can plug those in.
Well, let me see. So I'll just hit edit on the job. So just to follow this structure, you can always copy and paste.
And Diane and Charlotte, just to confirm, have you shared these forms with our WCS_training account?
Yes.
Yeah, I took your Alexa's sharks and rays. Yeah.
So I'll just take, oh great, you have the whole structure here. So I just copied and pasted. I think.
And as Rita's doing this, I know we're almost at time. So if you folks stay around, what we're going to do is we're going to click play and actually watch the job run and generate that SQL output and generate that other open function job. And so that's just kind of to set up the other infrastructure. And then from there's some extra steps to then like just what we did at the beginning of the session of syncing and extracting data, just how to do that to then run that data through this job that you've just outputted. So if you all stick around, we'll kind of keep walking through those steps. If not, stay tuned for the recording, documentation, when you're ready to get into it. But this is your one input step, is figuring out your form, figuring out your database prefixes and what you want those tables to be called, plugging it into this job and then running it. And then this job is going to generate that SQL. The job is going to generate the other job that can then start syncing the data. So it's a lot to wrap your head around to understand it, but the actual steps are really just editing this one job and then going from there.
Alexa, actually, in the what is it, line 13 of the code, shouldn't the table ID be the same than the one in the line above to make sure it goes to the same database table?
Great question. So that's up to you to decide. So if you want data mapping to if you want all the sharks and rays data mapping to the same table, then those multiple forms should share a table ID if they should go to the same table. But if you, for whatever reason, want to map the data to multiple tables, then you might have different table IDs. So that's a great question, because you could have multiple forms going to the same table. Awesome. And Jesse, I'm so sorry. I'm just seeing your note about your user. I'm taking a look at that right now. Do you have an open function count created with that email already?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. I'll add you to that now. That way you can see the training project.
Thank you.
So in the meantime, I will go ahead and run this. So just to recap, in this case, we have these two forms and we are mapping them we're creating two different database tables. So one will be called ConSoSci SR Sharks and Rays training demo table. And the other one will be called WCS Sharks and Rays.
You didn't put my training evaluation one.
I'm so sorry. I just need some.
No, that's fine. Let's go ahead.
We can run it multiple
the comments were a
times.
bit different. We get back to it in a second. Let me just look at if this one ran.
Rita, I think there was a lag. Did you click play on that?
Let me see. Yeah, that might be. Let me come back. So find updated forms.
Yep, it's running. I think your screen is just a little slow to load.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's possible.
So if you all flip over to activity history, you can see where Rita clicked play on that job A1 to then go fetch those forms that we just plugged in. And you'll see that open function then behind the scenes is running these other jobs. So then we are creating this Kobo script, and then also you know, creating this other job. So on Rita's screen, she'll pull up kind of the outputs of each of those jobs. So remember, we're interested in the output of job A3. That's the one that's actually generating the SQL. And then job A4, which is creating the jobs.
Are you seeing my screen, or is there still like? So.
Cool. So I see the successful run there.
Mm-hmm. I think this is the one.
And then
But
there's
okay. Yeah.
maybe I'll share my screen, Rita, and you can narrate.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Seems not to be loading.
Okay. Let me. Okay.
Okay, cool. I think maybe in that lag you clicked run on that first job a couple of times.
Yeah, that's possible.
If you see my screen here, so when you first ran it, that was down here at 6 o'clock, and then I can see that it then went through. Oh, see, someone's running it right now, and we can see that this job A3 and A4 are running there. So if we click into A3. Here where we can see we are generating this SQL script. So if multiple people are clicking on the job multiple times, it might already say, hey, we already created this table. We don't see that here, but this job A3 will create this SQL script that if you're connected with the database, it's going to automatically go ahead and describe changes to a table. So if you're making changes to your form, and let's say you add a question, it might choose to add a column to your table. So here we can see the different table names that the SQL script might be interacting with. And so if you have auto execute on, which we do in this case, it's automatically just going into that database and making those changes. But if you had that auto execute off, it would just have that SQL script that you could copy and paste and run yourself or modify yourself before you executed it. So that's that output of that job A3 is that SQL. And then A4 is telling us that a job was created. And so it's saying, hey, OpenFN went ahead and created this other job. So if we copy this here, and if I just go and search my jobs, I can see this auto one there. So even if I didn't search, if I just scroll down, you'll start to see that there's some of these jobs being created with this auto / prefix, and this tells you that this was like an automatically created job. And then if you click into the job, you can actually see what OpenFN outputted from that form. So I think one of these forms was the Sharks and Rays training demo, and we have these different upsert operations to access different tables, and then we're mapping data to those tables. So that's what that job is describing. It's creating these relationships as well between tables. So you'll see sometimes in some of these mappings, all these tables have different UUIDs, and then these jobs, what they can be done is you can turn them on, and you can run them through to start syncing the data as it's coming in. So just a quick flag is if multiple people are clicking on this right now, I think there's this cursor set up to only check for new form updates from a certain time period or things like that. So again, you might be choosing to adjust your cursor so that way it looks for all time new forms or things like that. But Rita, anything else that we should click around with here?
I just added the training eval form, so we can go try once again. Maybe we get a new form form update from that one because it's we haven't run it on yet.
Okay, so this one. Ah, I see. So Rita added that new form ID, training eval, table ID, cool. And so then if I click run, it's telling me my run has been enqueued. I can go to activity history. And I can see that these jobs are running to create these different outputs. So it looks like someone else might be clicking on this at the same time as well. But if I click into A3, for example, it looks like training evaluation. We're creating this table to capture training evalu information. So again, in this case, it's executing the SQL automatically, but you might choose to instead just generate the SQL script that you can copy and paste into the database. And then the second A4 output, it says, okay, great, it created this new job. So if I just copy that, and if I go search for my new jobs, I should see that there. And voila, there's that new job created today at 6:09, so just a minute ago. And I can click into that job and I can see this integration script that's set up to map to that database table there.
And then if you wanted to see the data itself, you would go to PostgreSQL and actually look at it, the database.
Yep. So then you can log into the database and then you can actually, that SQL script that I just showed you, if you have this set to auto execute, if you log into the database, that table will be there now. So this will be automatically configured. And then that second step, it gives you that job to then start loading data into that database. But that job isn't ready yet. It won't have data until you turn it on.
Okay.
And so that's the last step. So like basically everything to this point is like, how do you get all this set up? And then awesome, we have these cool new jobs here. Now I need to turn them on, actually give them the credentials, and it could be the same credentials, the same database, to start loading that data. And then I can figure out, okay, what's that extraction frequency do I want? Do I want to set up that job to pull every hour, every day? And then it pulls the data in. Then these jobs will start to load that into that table.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
So that's that A5 job that we talked about at the beginning. Is once you get through A3, that's setting up your database. A4 is writing that job. Turn on that job, give it a credential. Then you can go back to A5. And this is when you're telling OpenFunction, hey, what data do I want to get on a regular basis? And you see, again, we reference form ID. And again, we say, you know, what table do you want to be mapping this to? And then that's where then you can actually turn on the data sync. Any other questions?
I had a question about, like in the form, you find that there's some forms that have images. So I was just curious as to how the images are handled in this whole process. Like, are there folders that are created for the images in the database? And, like, what happens there? I don't know if you could clarify that.
That's a great question. So if you see on my screen, I actually have a sample Kobo message where it looks like it has some download links to images and attachments. So we see that a lot, is that folks will use Kobo Toolbox to collect images or voice notes or other sort of attachments. So this solution setup doesn't cover media and file streaming. Rather, what it will do is it will map the attachment link to where that's saved on the Kobo server. And so if you're viewing this in your database and you're a user that has access to that Kobo account, if you click on the attachment, it'll direct you to where to find that attachment or where to download it. But it doesn't do that step of streaming the media to your database. It is possible, but just not something that we've provided out of box with the solution, because a lot of times Kobo storage is free. And so if you're collecting media and images, that could be quite storage heavy. And so rather than storing that on your own database, a lot of organizations we work with rather keep that on their own Kobo toolbox instance, and then we'll just point to that from their database system. And so that way they don't also have to be maintaining this extra storage. But it is possible if you wanted to do that theoretically, but that would have to be kind of a customization that would take some time, and just kind of thinking about exactly how are you streaming that, where are you loading it? Are you really loading it to your database? Are you loading to another storage option? So the default is just to map that link to where you can download the file.
Okay, thanks. Great.
Any other questions?
I think this might be going back a little way, but where do you, in this kind of solution, if you, I take it if you were going to apply it now to your own project, you could kind of copy this code and you could import it into your own project on OpenFN. Is that sort of the idea?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So OpenFN has free forever accounts up to like a certain amount of like usage, so like how much you're processing. But through the ConSoSci partnership, we also have a set of projects available to the partnership. So if you're interested in kind of really getting this going, I recommend that kind of prototype it on your own project. Reach out if you want help kind of figuring out how to take what's on ConSoSci and getting it set up on your project, or thinking about where it might need to be customized to your organization's needs. But recommend kind of prototyping in your own project, and then from there kind of thinking about, okay, like who else do I add? And so long as they're OpenFN users, so they can just sign up for free, you can add them as well. And in that way, it's easy to share projects, to create new ones, and all of these solutions that we're developing are going to be continuing to be saved on that repository here.
Okay.
And
all right.
so
okay.
each of these have those different job scripts in these different folders, and then the documentation site provides a bit more guidance on kind of what those are.
Okay. Yeah. Because did we cover how you point it to your own database earlier on, or did I miss that section, or is it at the moment, is it going to the console? Is it going to the
Great question. No, I don't think we got too much into that.
Okay.
And we'll get more into that on Wednesday. But the short of it is, if you have this job that you just turned on, or that you just created, you can edit it to then add a credential. So you might choose to use one of the existing ones, or you might go over to credentials, and then you just plug in your database admin login. So if I click new credential at the bottom right, depending on what app I'm using, it's going to ask me for different information. If I'm using Microsoft SQL versus Postgres, I think they're quite similar. But then it's going to ask you to provide, the URL to where that lives, the port, database name, things like that. And then once you've created that credential, you can then link that to the job. So you might have many databases and many jobs, or you might have one database where all the jobs map to.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think, okay, now suddenly that bit of information makes it all clear. Great, thank you.
And what about data access here? So one of the reasons I hesitated to, in this process here during this training, link to one of my forms, or one of the forms that WWF has on Kobo, is just because I was uncertain of who would be able to see that data if I were to link it to this OpenFN account. Could you just provide some clarity on how that works?
Absolutely, great questions. So access at a first level is controlled on a project level. So Matthias, if you did have information you'd want to share with this group here, then absolutely don't sync it to the ConSoSci project. Sorry, I should have said that from the outset. But then that's where you want to sync to your own project. And in your own project, if you click in and you go to access and security, you'll see who else has access to it. So right now in this training project, I can see all these folks that have access to this training project. But in your own project, you'll see that it's only you. You can also choose to grant OpenFN support access. So we by default do not have access to your project or any information you're set up. But if for whatever reason you wanted us to kind of take a look at something you're trying to solve or set up and wanted us to just kind of do it securely within the project rather than sharing stuff over email or something, you can also turn on that on. And then only our admin support team folks can then choose to kind of log into your project to access whatever you might be sharing. So that's that support toggle on and off. But otherwise, you're in control of who has access. So if you want other folks to join, you can add them. You can set them up as administrators, or you can set them up as collaborators. Administrators have full access to the jobs and all that. Whereas collaborators don't have full access to editing all the jobs and set up like that. We also work with a lot of organizations that they'll have maybe just one or two central administrators in OpenFN that will be in charge of doing this initial setup, doing the ongoing monitoring, but generally try to keep that to quite a few users if there's sensitive data in particular. But there's this version control option where you can link a project to a GitHub repository. And so if you set up your project to link to a GitHub repository, that's one way to then set up all of these different job scripts, for example, to be run on GitHub. And folks that are working with maybe many different developers, what they'll do is their developers will maybe just work only with the scripts and only be pushing to GitHub, and then only the administrators have access to the actual OpenFN project where they might be pulling data in and mapping the data, versus this might be the developer only way to interact with the platform. So depending on your setup, those are some of the few options that are there. Not sure if you have any other specific questions.
No, this is perfect. Thank you. It's glad to know that there's a lot of other resources to find those details, but this is great. Thanks.
Yeah, and absolutely happy. Our team's always happy to kind of chat about that as well, because we know every organization is very different and different security settings. So there's actually a little chat icon right here. If you want to say hello, if someone's online, we usually get to that pretty quickly. If not, we'll get back to you as soon as someone's online. There's also a whole community. So if y'all are used to any of these other open source products or worked with Kobo before, we also have this OpenFN community, where if it's just general how-to knowledge, or if you're kind of on your own setting up your own project, want to get something going here, this might be a place to ask. But I also know a ConSoSci community type forum is also in the works. That might be a bit more targeted of your use case. But this, if you're just looking to generally know about OpenFN, a good resource to go and check out. And also links to our doc site as well. That just provides a lot more general information. But again, that ConSoSci repository will have a lot more specific to this use case in these solutions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I know we're well over time, but if you all join us on Wednesday, we'll be getting a little bit more into OpenFN, kind of go on your own route. But also, even if you're not a very technical person or someone who's not going to be doing a hands-on a lot of the setup, just talking generally like how we approach some of this integration design, kind of revisiting some of what we talked about today. And then just expanding on there. But if you're staying on for the advanced track, we're definitely going to get a lot more into job writing and how that's done. Excellent. So yeah, I'll hang around just for another minute in case there are any other questions, but otherwise, please, yeah, feel free to check out the doc site or reach out to ConSoSci, and happy to follow up with anyone individually there.